International Human Rights and Humanitarian Law Lectures. As all of you know, we organized these lectures because in the work that we do, we became sadly aware that although it took 60 years to develop the wonderful body of human rights and humanitarian law that we now have internationally and domestically in Canada, it seemed to be taking a much shorter time for governments around the world to dismantle that law in the name of security, particularly since September 11th, 2001. It was our belief, it is our belief, that significant enforcement of those bodies of law rests on public knowledge and education of the purpose of the laws and the public embracing them as part of their culture and insisting on enforcement. Under international law, Canada is obliged to have a policy and a program for educating the public, providing public education of international law, and we don't yet have, as far as we know yet, a policy, and we hope that this program that UBC has so wonderfully supported will be the beginning of a program in Canada. Now tonight I want to introduce you to our lecturer, Michael Byers. Michael Byers is a professor at UBC. He's the Canada Research Chair at the Liu Institute. I'm sure that most of you here are familiar with Michael. He's written many, many books on international humanitarian law and on Canadian foreign policy. As a lawyer, I'm a retired lawyer actually at this point in time, but as a lawyer who's worked in the human rights field, I have to say that the legal academic community in Canada in this perilous time has been sadly disconnected from commenting on issues to the public. So I'd like you all to welcome Michael Byers this evening. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. In January 2002, I had an encounter with something that became torture. In that that was the month when it became publicly known that the United States was taking prisoners from the battlefields of Afghanistan and moving them to Guantanamo Bay. And I was on sabbatical in England that year, back at Oxford. And when I heard that Donald Rumsfeld, the then Secretary of Defense of the United States, had peremptorily determined that none of these prisoners could be prisoners of war, I became quite angry. You see, I knew that Mr. Rumsfeld had just violated Article 5 of the Third Geneva Convention of 1949, which stipulates that if there is any doubt as to the status of someone who's apprehended on the battlefield, their status must be determined by a tribunal, a status determination tribunal, and not in a blanket manner by a Secretary of Defense. And when I get angry, I write. It's just my way of blowing off steam. And so I wrote a fairly angry op-ed explaining how Mr. Rumsfeld's decision was a violation of not just Article 5, but also of international human rights, and advanced the, at the time, somewhat lonely argument that people suspected of terrorism actually have human rights. And a lot came out of that, including thousands of emails, many of them quite hateful, some of them quite nice. I remember one of the nice ones. This is a little bit of a tangent, but it's a story worth telling. It was an email from someone who identified himself as an American veteran of the Vietnam War. He said, "Dear sir, thank you for your article in The Guardian. I was a prisoner of war in North Vietnam. And my captors violated the Geneva Conventions in their treatment of me. But, sir, were it not for the Geneva Conventions, I am certain they would have killed me." And that quite clearly was something that Donald Rumsfeld could not or chose not to understand. And I'll come back to that point later, because how we as a country deal with the issue of torture isn't just about morality, it's not just about law, it's also about protecting our soldiers. Because it conditions how the enemy might treat them in the event that our boys or girls fall into enemy hands. The day that that article came out in The Guardian, I received a phone call from a journalist named Alan Freeman, who writes for the Globe and Mail and who at that time was based in London. And Alan's a fine journalist, and he didn't waste any time. And all he said was, "Is there a Canadian angle to this?" And I said, well, there could be, because the United States is now in violation of the Geneva Convention, and that means that under Article 12 of the same convention, were we to capture anyone on the battlefield in Afghanistan, we could not transfer them to American hands. Alan's story appeared on the Globe and Mail front page the next morning. I believe that afternoon, Prime Minister Jean Chrétien was asked about this point during question period in the House of Commons. And his response, as I remember, was, "That's a hypothetical question." In other words, I don't need to answer that. Turned out that it wasn't so hypothetical. He'd been told it was hypothetical by his then defense minister, Art Eggleton. But Mr. Eggleton actually knew that Canadian soldiers in Afghanistan were capturing people on the battlefield already in January 2002 and transferring them to American hands. And this became public a couple of weeks later, thanks again to the Globe and Mail, which ran a photograph on its front page of prisoners being hustled out of the back of a helicopter in Afghanistan by soldiers in jungle green uniform. And every military expert who saw the photograph immediately went, "Hey, those are Canadian soldiers." Because American soldiers wouldn't be wearing green uniforms in one of the driest countries on earth. Our soldiers today are better equipped than they were in January 2002. But the point was that Mr. Chrétien had inadvertently misled the House of Commons, and not too surprisingly, it was only a matter of months before Mr. Eggleton was removed from his file, from his job as the Defense Minister of Canada. This story goes back. The story of the so-called detainees is now more than 6 years old. I'll come back to that shortly. But also in 2002, in the fall of 2002, a Canadian computer engineer was abducted while in transit at JFK Airport in New York and flown by the CIA to Jordan, where he was then driven to Syria and thrown into a hellhole of a prison, kept in a cell that was only 6 feet by 7 feet by 3 feet in dimension, and totally dark and damp, and occasionally taken out and tortured with an electric cable that was 2 inches thick, all the while not knowing what had happened to his wife and 2 young children, and wondering whether they might be somewhere else in that same prison, or perhaps who knows where. Now that Canadian citizen was, of course, Meher Arar. And I've got to know Meher. He's the most remarkable of individuals. He's very strong, he's very brave, but he's got that same hollowness in his eyes. And what he went through and what his family went through is almost beyond our imagination. And I mention this most specifically because, thanks to the heroism of Meher's wife, Monia Mazik, we all now know that Canadian officials were complicit in what happened to him. It's not just the Americans who are involved in this. It's not just, the usual nasties, the Syrias, the Uzbekistans, the Zimbabwe's, the Chiles under Pinochet. It's actually much closer to home, especially over the course of the last 5 or 6 years. Now, in January 2002, when we were transferring prisoners to American hands, yeah, we were violating Article 12 of the Geneva Convention. But honestly, I didn't think that the Americans were going to torture those prisoners. Did anyone here actually think, okay, well, Gail's been around a little bit, just a few years longer than I have. But in January 2002, I still held out hope. I had met by that point, having lived in North Carolina for a couple of years and having been working on issues related to the military, I had met a lot of very professional U.S. military officers by January 2002. And I knew that they prided themselves on obeying the laws of war. I'd met a lot of the judge advocate generals and found them to be better international lawyers than most of my academic colleagues. And so in January 2002, yeah, Canada shouldn't have been doing this, but if you're going to violate Article 12, well, transfer them to the Americans and don't transfer them to Egypt or to Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan I keep mentioning because in Uzbekistan they reportedly boil prisoners alive. And they still don't do that in the United States, as far as I know. They just do waterboarding instead, which is pretty bad. It's definitely torture. John McCain calls it exquisite torture. And I don't recommend that you try it at home. But in January 2002, it seemed to be more of a technical violation rather than complicity in something more egregious like actual torture. But over the course of the next few years, the Arar saga, the damning photographs from Abu Ghraib, the reports by credible news organizations like the New York Times and Washington Post concerning what was going on in Bagram Air Base, where Army medical doctors were actually reporting that prisoners had been murdered during detention and interrogation. When it all came out, those horrible photographs, Lindy England with an Iraqi man, almost certainly someone who was entitled to prisoner of war status on the end of a leash, and that prisoner with his arms extended and the hood over his head with the electrical cables dangling from his hands, standing on a box, being made to think that he was about to be electrocuted. I mean, all this had come out, and then as well those grossly unprofessional legal opinions supplied by politically appointed lawyers within the Bush administration seeking to justify torture, written by people like John Yoo, who still has tenure at the University of California at Berkeley. The body of evidence suggesting that the United States was violating torture in a systematic way had grown pretty significant by the summer of 2005. And I picked that particular date because it was in September 2005 that I discovered that Canada was still taking prisoners in Afghanistan and still transferring them to American hands. I know this because the next Chief of the Defense Staff, General Andrew Leslie, this is a prediction here, who will most likely replace Rick Hillier, had the honesty to actually tell journalists that at a press conference in Ottawa in September 2005. And I became angry again. Because, again, it's one thing to torture to people you don't, it's one thing to transfer to people you don't think will torture, and another thing to transfer when you know that they torture. I wrote an article in the Globe and Mail about this, pointing out how very illegal it was for Canada to be engaged in this behavior. And it was like a tree falling in a forest with no one around. I received absolutely no reaction to that article. Nothing. Usually I get tons of hate email when I do something like that, which is good because it means people are reading me. But there was nothing. And it wasn't until a couple of months later that I got the kind of feedback I was hoping for. And I had invited Bill Graham, who was then the defense minister, to come and to speak to one of my classes at UBC. And Bill was an international law professor for 10 years, and he likes to teach, and he's good at teaching. And he was coming to Vancouver, and there was a space in his schedule, and so he came and did this, and I'm very grateful for that. But of course, I also prepped my students, right? I mean, he's still the defense minister, and they're still transferring, right, in violation of international law. And so my students asked him about this quite pointedly, and asked him about solutions, and said, well, why don't we, build a detention facility in Afghanistan so we don't have to transfer the prisoners to anyone? And the response, the ridiculous response was, we can't afford to build a prison. I'm sorry, Bill, but he's not here. But if you hear the podcast, Bill, we can't afford to violate human rights. And I'll talk about that again a little bit later. But at the end of the lecture, we were walking out, and Mrs. Graham was there as well, and she came up to me and said, you're the guy who wrote that article in the Globe and Mail a couple of months ago. I said, yeah. I said, that was me. And very quietly she said, keep pushing. Bill agrees with you. He just can't say so right now. And a month later, the Canadian Department of National Defense signed a transfer arrangement with the government of Afghanistan. And I can only assume that that was done on the instruction of Bill Graham. Now, it just so happened that the Liberal Party and Bill Graham as the cabinet minister responsible, were in the midst of an election campaign when that arrangement was signed. It was signed by Rick Hillier on behalf of Canada. And the arrangement was not nearly as rigorous as it should have been. I know this because subsequently I and Amir Attaran, a heroic figure in this story, acquired detainee transfer arrangements that other NATO countries had done with Afghanistan in the months before we concluded ours. And their arrangements were so much better than ours. Ours simply said, we're handing over these prisoners, you have to promise to treat them properly, and you have to promise to let the International Committee for the Red Cross visit them, and that's it, essentially. Professor Attaran aptly called it a detainee laundering agreement. Now, the British, in contrast, or the Dutch, or the Danish, said, oh, we're transferring, you have to treat these people properly, and we have a right to come and check whenever we want to make sure that you're doing that. And not just us, but the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Torture can come and visit them at any time that he or she wants. And also, if you change anything concerning their situation, their location, you have to tell us. And, oh yeah, by the way, if you want to transfer them to another country, you have to get our approval first. Kind of stuff you would hope to see, and the kind of stuff that Rick Hillier presumably knew about, because, again, these were agreements signed by NATO countries, and he must have had them on his desk. Or whoever drafted our arrangement must have had them on his or her desk, and we chose not to follow those models of best practice. And we've paid a price for that. And Professor Attaran and Alex Neve from Amnesty International Canada and I told the government again and again, look, this arrangement is inadequate. This arrangement will cause problems. I remember testifying in December 2006 to the House of Commons Defense Committee and saying, look, it's easy. Take the British agreement, do a search and replace function on the computer, okay? Type in United Kingdom, search, replace with Canada. Push the button, you've got your new transfer arrangement. It's as easy as that. Oh no, we don't need to do this. This is, we're fine. We trust the Afghan authorities. Or perhaps the worst argument of all is if we don't trust them, they won't develop into the kind of functional human rights respecting state that we want. That we're trying to rebuild their country. We shouldn't be looking over their shoulder all the time. Ask any parent of a 5-year-old whether that's necessarily a good approach. Yes, you have to give them some freedom, but you also have to make sure that they're playing within the lines. And Afghanistan, of course, is a country where the concept of human rights is not perhaps as deep and as long-standing as in a country like Canada. And it all blew up in the government's face. About a year ago, in the spring of 2007, thanks in large part to some investigative journalism by Graham Smith from the Globe and Mail, who did something a little bit unusual for a Canadian journalist in Kandahar. He went off the base without military minders. And he started talking to ordinary Afghans. And he actually found some people who had been prisoners of Canada, who had been transferred to the Afghan authorities, and who were claiming to have been tortured. Claiming to have been tortured. None of this has been adjudicated. No one can say that these people were tortured. But there are allegations of torture. And some of them were quite serious. Perhaps the most serious included one man who said the Canadians were just outside while I was being tortured, and they must have heard my screams. Again, it's just an allegation, but a couple of dozen of individuals claiming that they had been mistreated once they had left Canadian hands. And again, this allegation that Canada was not just playing fast and loose with the transfers, but actually knew that something untoward was going on. And this caused a storm in the House of Commons. It caused the Prime Minister to say, I think, the worst thing that he's ever said, which was to suggest that those of us who were concerned about the rights of the prisoners somehow didn't care about Canadian soldiers. And this is where I want to come back to something I touched on before, about how these rights, these obligations are not just moral or legal, but also have practical consequences. One of the reasons why international humanitarian law has rules concerning prisoners of war, including a prohibition on any torture or mistreatment, is because soldiers have realized for decades that there's a practical reason for encouraging people to surrender in circumstances where they are faced with certain death. I mean, think about it. If you are a soldier and your back's to the wall, you're facing a larger, better equipped force. If you know that if you put down your weapon and put up your hands, that you will be taken into custody and well treated, and then released at the end of the hostilities, not having been punished for fighting in the war, you're probably going to put down your weapon. But if you think that there's a danger that once you surrender, you will be tortured, you're going to fight to the death. And people who are fighting to the death are very dangerous to those who they are fighting against. And so if the insurgents in Afghanistan have any reason to believe that they will be tortured if they surrender to Canadian soldiers, they're going to be less likely to surrender, and that will increase the risks to our soldiers. So, just to make sure that you followed this, by not caring sufficiently about the rights of prisoners in Afghanistan, it is possible that Mr. Harper and his colleagues have actually indirectly caused the deaths of some Canadian soldiers. So, who cares about our soldiers more? The Amir Attarans or the Stephen Harpers? Think about it. And I can tell you, because I know this, that even those who, in their political and bureaucratic deliberations, think that torture is not so bad, or that sharing intelligence with states that torture is not so bad, or turning a blind eye to CIA planes refueling in Gander is not so bad, that those sorts of people retreat quickly from those positions when their behavior is brought into public view. Which is why, and I will close with this, I'm confident that another Canadian, a young man named Omar Khadr, will actually come back to Canada one day. And I won't give you the full story of Mr. Khadr, apart from saying that, like many of you and like I, he is a Canadian citizen. And he has been held in a legal black hole for around 6 years now. He was taken there as a child, and he has almost certainly been tortured in some way. And while every other Western ally of the United States has repatriated its nationals from Guantanamo Bay, Canada has not done so with respect to Mr. Khadr. And it is a shame and a stain on this country that he remains there today. A U.S. naval officer named William Keebler, who, in representing Mr. Khadr over the last number of months, has brought this into the spotlight in a way that is beginning to put real pressure on the Harper government, which of course does not want to bring Khadr back to Canada for a complex range of reasons, including probably, a light dash of racism. But the pressure is building, and people are starting to remember Omar Khadr's name. They're starting to see the incongruity of Guantanamo Bay and Canadian citizenship, at a minimum, at least. And of course, there are the hundreds of other men who probably shouldn't be there either. But Mr. Khadr, I think, will one day, in all likelihood, go free. At which point, I'd love to have him as a student at UBC. Because we can't write people off because of our assumptions, or because of what might have happened to them through our negligence, or brand them as criminals because of what we think their parents might have done. The whole principle of a rule of law is to treat each individual as an individual and to recognize and uphold their individual rights. And in a country like Canada, with so much that has gone on and this inconsistent and often egregious record over the last 6 years, I would call on all of you to focus on Mr. Khadr as your current cause célèbre. There are, about 120 people here tonight? If you all decided you wanted to get Khadr out of Guantanamo Bay, and you all applied maximum pressure, told all your friends, wrote letters to various media outlets and to politicians of various kinds, and went and asked inconvenient questions when conservative politicians came to town, that you and yourselves could probably set him free. Such is the force of justice and truth and principle when it stands up against those who don't uphold those things. Those who violate these rights often have large armies and very deep pockets, but they cannot stand up effectively against the power of what is right. That is the great thing about international human rights and international humanitarian law. It's not all of the treaties. It's not the court judgments. It's the power of these things, rooted in principle, rooted in humanity, and rooted in morality. These things actually have power. And the treaties and the court judgments are just manifestations of that power. The power runs much deeper and much stronger. And I tell you, as someone who has seen too much of this in a relatively short life, that that's what gives me optimism, that's what gives me hope, because I know that this power is something that we can all harness. And so the only challenge for me is to get more and more people to buy into this understanding so that we collectively harness it. Because then human rights will win again. Thank you.
Michael,
opportunity to listen to it. My question is really brief. Just wanted to ask you about the term the war on terror from a legal point of view. Some weeks ago I was watching YouTube, and the American historian Howard Zinn said something interesting to me, that war is terror. And in a sense it becomes an absurdity. So if that's the case, what are we doing in Afghanistan? If you could perhaps explain that from a legal point of view. Thank you.
There's a long history to the term war, and most of the legal content in international law was taken out of the word war through the UN Charter's prohibition of the threat or use of force. See, what happened is that states after 1928, the adoption of the Kellogg-Briand Pact simply stopped declaring war, because under law as it was interpreted then, as long as you didn't say it was war, then you could do it. And the drafters of the UN Charter said, well, look, this is clearly not an acceptable situation, so let's not deal with the word law, let's just deal with force, the threat or the use of force. War obviously has rhetorical impact today, particularly with the general public. And the use of the term war on terror, signaled a fundamental choice of direction in terms of the response to the events of September 11, 2001. And you could just as easily and more appropriately have regarded it as a criminal matter, okay? And dealt with it in terms of international police and judicial cooperation, okay? And which is what was done during the first attack on the World Trade Center back in the early 1990s. This is really serious, and we should all come together in the United Nations and craft solutions to the fundamental root causes of terrorism and deal with the perpetrators as criminals rather than the enemy. How different would our world be today? Right? And
do you want to change the world? Go beyond protesting. Register your opinion about Canada's involvement in Afghanistan on ourpolls.ca. Let your vote be counted. Second, demand direct democracy. Never let politicians decide for you. Finally, when you believe in our collective social consciousness, we will change the world.